You're standing in line, card already in your hand before you've even ordered. The barista calls out a number that used to make you flinch, $6, and you don't even blink anymore. You tap, you grab your drink, you walk out. Total transaction time, 90 seconds. Total thought given to what you just paid for, 0. Here's the number that should stop you cold. The actual cost of the ingredients in that latte, the milk, the espresso shot, the cup, the lid, is somewhere between 80 cents and $1.20. That's it. Which means on a $6 drink, you're looking at a gross margin north of 80%. 80%. That's not a coffee shop. That's a printing press. So here's the question that should be bothering you right now. If the margins are that insane, why does the independent cafe 2 blocks from your apartment, the one with the better coffee, the friendlier staff, the cozier chairs, close within 18 months? Why does the chain across the street open its 4th location this year? While she's still fighting to make August's rent, the ingredients are basically the same. The markup is basically the same. So that 80% margin clearly isn't the whole story. Something else is happening behind that counter, something that has almost nothing to do with coffee at all. Let's clear something up, because it changes everything that follows. Starbucks is not a coffee company. It plays one on television. What it actually is, at its core, in its boardroom decisions, in the way it evaluates every single location before signing a lease, is a real estate company that happens to serve coffee as the excuse to occupy that real estate. This isn't a cynical take. It's literally the strategy, and it has a name. Executives call it the third place. Not home, not work, but the place in between, the spot your brain associates with a 5-minute pause in an overstimulated day. And here's the thing about a third place. Once it's wired into your routine, you stop comparison shopping. You don't cross the street to save 80 cents. You just go. That habitual, almost unconscious loyalty is worth more to the business than any single transaction, because it's predictable, and predictable revenue is the most valuable thing in retail. Now compare that to how the independent cafe owner picks her location. She's working with a tight budget, so she looks for charm, character, maybe a lower rent because the block isn't fully discovered yet. Reasonable instinct. Completely different game than the one being played across the street. Starbucks doesn't pick locations on charm. It picks them using foot traffic modeling. Data on how many people walk past a corner at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. How many of them are already commuters with disposable income? How visible the storefront is from a crosswalk. Then it negotiates a 10-year lease with pricing power most independent operators can't touch, because a landlord anchoring a block with a recognizable, reliable tenant will often accept a lower base rent in exchange for the credibility that tenant brings to the whole property. Here's the myth worth killing right now. Cheaper rent is not automatically the smarter business decision. Sometimes paying more for a location with guaranteed traffic is the actual bargain. And paying less for a hidden gem is the trap that quietly bankrupts good businesses with great coffee. So if location and loyalty are only 2 pieces of the puzzle, the next question is unavoidable. What does the actual day-to-day math look like behind that counter, drink by drink, hour by hour, before a single dollar counts as profit? Let's stop talking in vague percentages and actually open the books. The numbers most customers never see, the ones that separate a business that scales from one that barely survives its first year. A typical Starbucks store pulls in somewhere around $3 million in annual revenue. Sounds enormous until you start subtracting. Cost of goods, the coffee, milk, cups, pastries, eats up roughly 30% of that. Labor is the next big bite, typically another 25 to 30%, covering baristas, shift supervisors, and a store manager. Then rent, utilities, equipment maintenance, corporate overhead allocation, marketing contribution. By the time you're done subtracting, you land at an operating margin in the 15 to 20% range for a mature, well-run store. Healthy, not obscene. Definitely not the 80% gross margin illusion we opened with. Here's where it gets interesting. Though the number that actually determines whether a location survives isn't the margin percentage. It's throughput. How many drinks can that store physically sell per hour during the morning rush when almost all the day's profit gets made? Do the break-even math with me. Say a location has roughly $12,000 in fixed daily costs, rent, base labor, utilities, all divided down to a daily number. At an average ticket of $6 and a 70% contribution margin after ingredient cost, that store needs to sell around $2,800 worth of drinks, roughly 470 transactions, just to hit 0 for the day. Everything after that first surge of the morning is where real profit starts accumulating. Now here's the brutal part for the independent cafe. She's working with the same rough math, similar margins, similar costs, but she doesn't have the customer volume to hit 470 transactions reliably. Because she doesn't have the decade of brand conditioning that turns "I need caffeine" into "I'm going there" without a second thought. Her break-even point isn't a math problem, it's a traffic problem. And traffic is the one variable she has the least control over. This is the part almost nobody clocks when they see a $6 latte and assume the owner is getting rich off you. The margin was never really the issue. Volume was always the real game, and volume is bought, not earned, through years of habit building. Most small operators can't afford to wait for, but margin and volume only explain the operating side of the business. There's a second engine running quietly in the background. One that has nothing to do with selling drinks at all, and almost nobody realizes they're personally powering it every time they open an app. Open your Starbucks app right now. Actually do it. There's a decent chance you're sitting on 10, 20, maybe $40 of loaded balance you forgot about. Money you preloaded weeks ago for a convenience fee that felt too small to notice. Here's the sentence that should make you put your phone down and pay attention. That money isn't sitting in a digital wallet waiting for you. It's already been counted, already been put to work, already functioning as free financing for a multi-billion-dollar company. And you're the one who supplied it. This is the part of the business model that almost nobody outside a finance department ever thinks about. When you load money onto that app, it doesn't sit there neutrally. On the company's books, it shows up as a liability, a promise to eventually deliver you a coffee. But until you redeem it, that cash is real, spendable, working capital, and the company pays you zero interest for the privilege of holding it. You've essentially handed over an interest-free loan, and you did it voluntarily, in exchange for a free drink promise and a slightly faster checkout line. Now here's the twist that turns this from clever into genuinely brilliant. Not everyone redeems that balance. Some of it, a meaningful, predictable percentage every single year, just sits there, forgotten, abandoned, never spent. In accounting terms, this is called breakage. And once enough time passes, breakage stops being a liability on the books and becomes pure recognized profit. Money that was never earned through a transaction. Money that appeared because millions of people, all doing the same small forgetful thing, collectively left cash on the table. Multiply that by tens of millions of active app users. And you're not looking at pocket change. You're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars a year, generated not from making better coffee, not from opening more stores, but from human forgetfulness at scale. And Starbucks didn't invent this. Airlines have been doing it with miles for decades. Gift card companies count on it every holiday season. It's one of the most quietly effective financing tools in modern retail, hiding in plain sight behind a friendly app icon and a free birthday drink notification. So the real question isn't whether this is happening to you. It almost certainly already is. The real question is what happens when the raw ingredient behind the product itself becomes unpredictable, volatile, even dangerous to a business that isn't sitting on this kind of financial cushion. Picture a bad harvest season in Brazil. A frost hits at exactly the wrong moment, wiping out a meaningful chunk of the world's Arabica supply. Within weeks, wholesale coffee prices spike, not by 5 or 10%, but sometimes by 30, 40, even 50% in a single stretch. For most people, this is a headline they scroll past. For a business built on coffee, it's an earthquake. The question is simply, who's built to survive it? Meet Maria. She owns that independent cafe we've been circling back to. Great espresso, loyal regulars, wafer-thin margins. She buys her beans the way most small operators do, at spot price, month to month, from a regional distributor, with no long-term contract locking anything in. When that frost hits Brazil, her cost of goods jumps almost overnight. She's got two brutal options: eat the cost and watch her already thin margin disappear, or raise prices and risk losing the regulars who chose her specifically because she wasn't the $6 chain down the street. Either way, she's absorbing a shock she never saw coming and has no tools to soften. Now look at what's happening across the street at the exact same moment. Starbucks isn't buying coffee at spot price in a panic. It's buying through futures contracts and multi-year supplier agreements, locked in months or years in advance, often with pricing built around long-term relationships with specific farming regions. When the frost hits, the company isn't scrambling. It already knew, roughly, what it would pay for beans a year from now, insulated from the very volatility currently gutting Maria's margin. This is the piece almost nobody accounts for when they compare a big chain to a small shop. It's not just that Starbucks has more stores, more capital, more brand loyalty. It's that scale buys access to an entirely different financial toolkit. One built for managing risk before it happens, not reacting to it after the damage is done. Maria isn't losing because she makes worse coffee or works less hard. She's losing because she's structurally locked out of the exact tools that would let her survive the same storm Starbucks barely notices. And once you see that gap, real estate leverage, forgotten balance profit, hedged supply chains, a much bigger, much more uncomfortable pattern starts to emerge about why 9 out of 10 independent shops like hers don't make it past year 2. Here's a number worth sitting with. The failure rate for independent food and beverage businesses in the first few years is staggeringly high, with the vast majority closing before they ever get the chance to become the neighborhood institution their owner dreamed of. Meanwhile, established chains keep opening new locations, year after year, in cities that supposedly have too many coffee shops already. That contrast isn't an accident, and it isn't really about coffee quality. It's about which businesses are structurally allowed to survive a bad year. Think back through everything we've just walked through, because none of it works in isolation. It's the combination that becomes almost unfair. The real estate strategy means a location was never chosen on charm. It was chosen because the data already proved people would show up, which solves the traffic problem that quietly kills most independents. The store-level math means that once traffic is guaranteed, hitting break-even isn't a daily gamble. It's a predictable formula. The loyalty program means the business is partly financed by its own customers, interest-free, before a single drink is ever poured. And the hedged supply chain means that when the raw ingredient itself gets more expensive overnight, the shock barely registers on the balance sheet. Now imagine Maria facing all 4 of those disadvantages simultaneously. She's fighting for foot traffic on a location she chose because the rent was survivable, not because a data model proved it would work. She has no financing cushion, sitting quietly in a prepaid app. And the one time the market throws a curveball, a bad harvest, a shipping delay, a tariff, she absorbs the full impact with no hedge to soften the landing. She's not failing because she's a worse entrepreneur. She's failing because she's playing a fundamentally different, much harder version of the same game, without ever being told the rules had changed. This is the real, unglamorous explanation behind those 9 out of 10 fail statistics you've probably seen thrown around without context. It was never really about coffee, or hustle, or passion. It's about which businesses get access to leverage, and which ones are left exposed to every shock at once. Which raises the question every viewer watching this should actually be asking themselves next. If scale is this powerful, does that make the stock itself a smart place to put your own money? So let's flip the lens. Everything up to this point has been about why the business works so well operationally. But understanding why a company dominates its market and deciding whether to actually own a piece of it are 2 completely different questions. And conflating them is how a lot of smart people end up making mediocre investments. Start with the trend that matters most. Gross margin direction. A company with expanding margins is getting more efficient, more disciplined, extracting more value from the exact same footprint. A company with shrinking margins, even while revenue keeps climbing, is often quietly telling you that growth is starting to cost more than it's worth. That distinction, growth versus efficient growth, is where a lot of investors get fooled by a headline revenue number that looks great on the surface. Then there's a risk unique to businesses built on this level of scale: saturation. Remember that whole advantage about traffic-modeled real estate. At some point, a company runs out of undiscovered high-traffic corners. New locations start competing with existing ones for the same customers instead of capturing new ones, a phenomenon called cannibalization. When that starts happening, same-store sales growth slows, and that's usually the first crack that shows up in quarterly earnings long before the stock price reacts. Labor cost is the next pressure point worth watching closely. Unionization efforts, minimum wage increases, and rising benefits costs all chip directly into that operating margin we calculated earlier. A business model built partly on lean labor costs is exposed here in a way that's easy to overlook when you're only looking at revenue growth. And here's the one most retail investors never check: buybacks. A company can make earnings per share look fantastic simply by reducing its share count, even if actual net income barely moved. That's not necessarily dishonest, but it means you have to look past the headline EPS number and ask whether the underlying business is actually growing, or whether financial engineering is doing the heavy lifting. None of this is a stock tip, and it shouldn't be treated like one. It's a framework, the same 4-part lens we just built, aimed at your portfolio instead of your morning coffee. And that framework is exactly what you're walking away with. Go back to that line you were standing in at the very start of this video. Card already out, $6 already committed, not a single thought given to what you were actually paying for. You know better now. That 80% margin was never the real story. The real story was everything happening just underneath it. Real estate chosen by data instead of charm. A loyalty app quietly financing operations with your forgotten balance. A supply chain hedged years in advance against shocks that flatten smaller competitors overnight. And unit economics engineered so precisely that break-even becomes a formula instead of a gamble. That's not a coffee business. That's a machine. And now you know exactly how it runs. Here's what to actually do with that. The next time you're evaluating a stock, a franchise opportunity, or even a friend's can't-miss business idea, don't start with the product. Start with these 4 questions. Does it control its real estate or just rent it? Does it have a financing advantage most competitors can't access? Is it hedged against the volatility that could sink a smaller player? And do the unit economics actually scale or just look good on a slide? Ask those 4 questions before you ask anything else, and you'll see through the hype faster than most people in the room. The latte was never really the product. You just learned what was.